Advance praise for creating a life together before aspiring community builders hold their first meeting, confront their first realtor, or drive their first nail. They must buy this essential book. It will improve their chances for success immensely and will certainly save them money, time, and heartbreak. In her friendly but firm, and occasionally funny, way, Diana Christian proffers an astonishing wealth of practical information and sensible, field-tested advice. ERNESDCALLENBCH, author, Ecotopia and Ecotopia Emerging Wow. The newest, most comprehensive Bible for builders of intentional communities. Covers every aspect with vital information and dozens of examples of how successful communities faced the challenges and created their shared lives out of their visions. The cautionary tales of sadder experiences and how communities fail will help in avoiding the pitfalls. Not since I wrote the foreword to Ingrid Kammer's Living the Dream, 1983, which documented the Twin Oaks community, have I seen a more useful and inspiring book on this topic. Hazel Henderson, author CRATING, Alternative FUTURES and Politics of the Solar, a really valuable resource for anyone thinking about intentional community. I wish I had it years ago. SDARHAWK, author of WEBS of Power, The Spiral Dance, ANDTHE Fifth Sacred Thing, and longtime community member. Every potential ecovillager should read it. This book will be an essential guide and manual for the many permaculture graduates who live in communities or design for them. Bill Mollison, co-founder of the permaculture movement and author, Permaculture, a designer's manual creating a new culture of living peacefully with each other, and the planet is our #1 need. And this is the right book at the right time. Creating a life together will help community founders avoid fatal mistakes. I can't wait to tell people about it. Hildur Jackson, co-founder Global Ecovillage Network, Jen, co-editor Ecovillage Living, RESDURING The Earth and Her People. Creating a life together is a comprehensive, engaging, practical, well-organized, and thoroughly digestible labor of love. Hopefully scores of wannabe community founders and seekers will discover it before they launch their quest for community, and avoid the senseless and sometimes painful lessons that come from trying to reinvent the wheel. This book is a gift to humanity, helping to move forward the elusive quest for community, fueling a quantum leap towards a fulfilling, just, and sustainable future. GOPHKOZNY, producer-editor of video documentary, Visions of Utopia, EXPERIMENTS in Sustainable Culture. While anyone can build a village, a subdivision, or a housing development, the challenge is filling it with people who can get along, who can reach agreements, and who can achieve far more together than they ever could alone. If your aspiring ecovillage or intentional community gets even this far, and this awesome book will show you how, then maybe you have a realistic chance of living sustainably, and by example, of changing the world. My appreciation grows daily for this thorough, practical, and engaging guide. Albert Bates, Director, Ecovillage Training Center, and INTRNATIONALSECRETRY, Ecovillage Network of the Americas. Developing a successful community requires a special blend of vision and practicality woven together with wisdom. Consider this book a marvelous mirror. If the abundant, experience-based practicality in this book delights you, then you probably have the wisdom to realize your vision. Robert Gilman, founding editor of In Context, a quarterly of Humanities Culture, and author of Ecovillages and Sustainable Communitiso. Many well-intended communities fail because they don't even know the questions to ask, let alone where to find answers. This book offers a wealth of detailed information that will help guide communities to finding what is right for their specific situation and greatly increase their odds of their success. KATHRYN MCCMANT, COHOUSING resident, architect, and project manager, and author of COHOUSING. New Society, PUBLSHRS. Cataloging and publication data. A catalog record for this publication is available from the National Library of Canada. Copyright 2003 by Diana Leafe Christian. All rights reserved. Cover design by Diane McIntosh. Cover art by Sally A. Sellers. Detail from Family in B-flat. 1998 hand-dyed. hand-painted and commercial cottons 45x81. Illustrations by Jacob Stevens. Printed in Canada by Friesens. Second printing. July 2004, New Society Publishers acknowledges the support of the Government of Canada through the Book Publishing Industry Development Program, BPIDP, for our publishing activities. Paperback ISBN 086571471. 1 Inquiries regarding requests to reprint all or part of Creating a Life Together should be addressed to New Society Publishers at the address below. To order directly from the publishers, please add $4.50 shipping to the price of the first copy, and $1 for each additional copy, plus GST in Canada. Send check or money order to New Society Publishers, P.O. Box 189, Gabriola Island, BCV 0R1X0, Canada 1-800-567-6772. New Society Publishers. Mission is to publish books that contribute in fundamental ways to building an ecologically sustainable and just society, and to do so with the least possible impact on the environment in a manner that models this vision. We are committed to doing this not just through education, but through action. We are acting on our commitment to the world's remaining ancient forests by phasing out our paper supply from ancient forests worldwide. This book is one step towards ending global deforestation and climate change. It is printed on acid-free paper that is 100% old-growth forest-free, 100% post-consumer recycled, processed chlorine-free, and printed with vegetable-based, low VOC inks. For further information or to browse our full list of books and purchase securely, visit our website at www.newsociety.com. New Society Publisher www.newsociety.com. Dedication for my friend Al Rash for helping make this book possible, and for my mother Rosetta Neff for abiding loyalty, good humor, and every kind of support. Acknowledgements. Zay Forward by Patch Adams. Roman 12 Introduction. CREATNG, A Life Together. Roman 15, The Successful 10%. Our intentional communities and ecovillages. Roman 16 co-housing communities. Now, you'll learn here. Roman 18, is this information really necessary? Roman 19, is this advice corporate? Roman 19, how to use this book. Roman 20, Part 1, Planting the Seeds of Healthy Community. 1 Chapter 1, THE successful 10% and why 90% fail. 2 Lost Valley, how one group did it. 3 What works, what doesn't work. 4 The successful 10%. 5 Why 90% fail. 6 Structural conflict and 6 ways to reduce it. 7 What will it cost? 9 How long does it take? 10 How many people do you need? 10 Chapter 2 Your role as founder. 14 What kind of person founds a community? 15 What else you'll need? 16 If only I had known. 18 Chapter 3 GTTING off to a good start. 20 Don't run out and buy land yet. 22 When you already own the property. 23 Organizing your group. 24 Getting real about finances. 29 Collecting funds. 31 Vi Table of Contents. Raising money from supporters. 31 Attracting and integrating new members. 32 Creating community glue. 33 Pioneers, settlers, and the flow of members. 34 Chapter 4 Community Vision, what it is, why you need it. 35 Sound a clear note. 36 elements of a community's vision. 37 your vision documents and vision statements. 38 do it first. 40 Chapter 5 CRATNG Vision Documents. 42 more than one vision. 43 a sacred time. 45, that's not community. Hidden expectations and structural conflict. 45, exploring the territory. 47, sharing from the heart. 52, writing it down. 53, Chapter 6, Power, Decision-Making, and Governance. 55, Power, the ability to influence. 55, focused power, widespread power. 56, how consensus works. 56, what you need to make consensus work. 58, pseudo-consensus and structural conflict. 60, agreement seeking, when you don't want to use full consensus. 62, multi-winner voting. 62, community governance, spreading power widely. 63, more than one form of decision-making. 63, what decision-making method should you use? 65, Part 2, Sprouting New Community, TCHNIQES and TOOLS. 67, Chapter 7, AGREMENTS and Policies, Good Documents Make Good Friends. 68, Remembering Things Differently. 69 giving yourselves every chance of success. 70 your community's agreements and policies. 71 abundant dawns agreements. 73 Chapter 8, Making It Real. ESDABLISHNG your legal entity. 75 Why you need a legal entity before buying your property. 75 Using a lawyer. 76 Finding the right lawyer. 78 Chapter 9, The Great Land Buying Adventure. 80 Legal Barriers to Sustainable Development. 80 Shopping for counties, zoning regulations, building codes, sustainable homesteads, and jobs. 82 The Proactive Land Search. 84 Friendly loans from friends and family. 85 Onerous owner financing, better than none at all. 86 Do-it-yourself refinancing with a shoebox bank. And 90 When one person buys the property. 91 Acquiring fully developed turnkey property, confidence, persistence, and negotiation. 92 If at first you don't succeed. 95 Chapter 10, Finding the Right Property. 99 Choosing your site criteria. 99 How much land do you want? 99 Raw land, lower initial cost, years of effort. 100 Developed land, electricity, toilets, and showers. 101 Fully developed turnkey property, move right in with a big financial bite. 102 Buying property like the professionals do. 103 Conducting the search, on your own or with a real estate agent. 108 Investigating likely properties. 109 Taking property off the market while you do further research. 112, Chapter 11, NEIGHBORS and zoning. 114, how zoning issues can impact community plans. 114, zoning issues and your property. 116, gambling with former use permits. 118, seeking a zoning exception. 119, negotiating for what you want. 121, zoning exceptions, neighbors, and public hearings. 122, Chapter 12, FINANCNG, your property, loans you can live with. 126, about renting money, what you should know. 126, VI, private financing. 129, when one member buys the property. 129, protecting your sole owner with a triple net lease. 130, owner financing. 131, bank financing. 132, drawing on the co-housing model. 136, what about grants and donations? 139, refinancing your property. 139, Chapter 13, developing sustainable human settlements. 142, Earthaven's development process. 142, listening to your land. 146, creating your site plan yourselves. 146, avoiding urban refugee syndrome. 147, creating privacy in the midst of community. 148, designing for conviviality. 149, Chapter 14, internal community FINANCES, can we afford to live there? 152, rural communities, how will your members make a living? 153. The risks of community businesses. 155. Keeping member assessments affordable. 159. Joining fees. 159. Housing arrangements. 163. Site lease fees and the debt load. 164. Labor requirements. 165. Building equity. 167. Can people afford to join you? 168. Chapter 15. Legal entities for OWNG property. 170. Checklist for choosing a legal entity. 170. How you'll hold title and arrange members' use rights. 171. Organizational flexibility. 173. How you'll be taxed. 174. Overview. Corporations and nonprofit corporations. 174. Limited liability corporations, LLCs. 176. Homeowners associations, tax advantages and disadvantages. 178. Condominium associations. 182. Housing co-ops, separate ownership and use rights. 183. Non-exempt nonprofit corporations. 185X. Chapter 16. If you're using a tax-exempt nonprofit. 189. Advantages of a 501c3 donations, tax breaks, limited liability. 189. Disadvantages of a 501c3 onerous requirements, irrecoverable assets. 190. Land owning entities and 501c3 corporations, the best of both worlds. 192. How one group retained control of its board. 194. Title holding corporations, collecting income from passive sources. 194 private land trusts, protecting the land. 195 community land trusts, an irrevocable decision. 196 for common treasury communities, 501D nonprofit corporations. 196 Part 3, Thriving in Community, ENRICHING the soil. 199 Chapter 17, Communication, Process, and Dealing with Conflict, the Heart of Healthy Community. 200 The Rock Polisher Effect. 201 Nourishing Sustainable Relationships. 202 The Roots of Conflict, Emotionally Charged Needs. 203 High Woundedness, High Willingness. 205 7 Kinds of Community Conflict We Wish We'd Left Behind. 206 24 Common Sources of Community Conflict. 207 The Fine Art of Offering Feedback. 210 Receiving Feedback, Listening for Kernels of Truth. 210 Thrashing Meetings. 212 Creating Specific Conflict Resolution Agreements. 213 Helping each other stay accountable to the group. 214 Graduated Series of Consequences. 215 Chapter 18, SCLECTING People to Join You. 218 Select for Emotional Maturity, The Narrow Door. 219 But Is It Community? 221 Passive Victims, Outraged Victims. 221 Membership Screening and the Law. 223 Dealing Well with Saying No. 223 How Can You Tell? 224 Questions, References, Long Engagements. 226 Appendix 1, Sample Community Vision Documents. 230 Appendix 2, Sample Community AGREMNTS. 233 Appendix 3, setting up and maintaining a 501 C3 nonprofit. 238 Arias Orcias. 241 Index. 245X. ZAS, someone who knew little of intentional communities in 1992. I'm grateful to those devoted activists in the Fellowship for Intentional Community who patiently educated me. Laird Schaub, Geoff Cosney, Caroline Ests, Jenny Upton, Dan Questenberry, Tony Cerna, Harvey Baker, Elf Morgan, Gillian Downey, Tree Bresson, Betty Didcock, and Paul DeLapa. I couldn't have written this book without being editor of Communities magazine for the last decade, and have learned much from its staff, columnists, contributors, and guest editors. Lance Scott, Billy Miracle, Ellie Sommer, Velma Kahn, Cecil Shade, McCune Renwick Porter, Jacob Stevens, Tristan Massett, Bill Metcalf, Albert Bates, Jan Bowman, Erwin Zucker, Douglas Stevenson, Carolyn Schaffer, Steve Niesgoda, Joyce Foote, Robert Foote, Deborah Altis, Tim Miller, Joe Peterson, Lois Arkin, Hank Obermeyer, Jeff Grossberg, Blair Vivotic, Michael McIntyre, Daniel Greenberg, Jeff Clearwater, Rob Sandelin, Luke Reed, Larry Kaplovitz, Alana Can, Bill Fleming, and Patricia Green. I am deeply grateful to the Fellowship for Intentional Community for generous permission to excerpt information from 10 years of Arctic Lesson Communities magazine, which helps illustrate community principles in every single chapter of thy's book. I appreciate the shared stories and insights of community veterans Judy Anders, Dave Jackie, John Charamella, Patch Adams, Brad Jarvis, Corrine McLaughlin, Gordon Davidson, Stephen Gaskin, Michael Trogan, Diamond Jameson, River Jameson, Susanna McDougall, Stephen Brown, Barbara Conroy, Don Lindeman, Katie McCammond, Chuck Durrett, and especially Colorado compadres Buzz Burrell, Denise Kate, Zev Payas, Panther Wilda, the late Mike Mariner, Alan Butcher, Ben Lipman, David Lynch, John Cruikshank, John and Betsy McKinney, Judith Yarrow, Rob Jones, Jan Laser, Nancy Wood, and Jim Wetzel. I am grateful to the people who helped set me on the path towards learning, teaching, and writing about communities. Dan Drassen, Dorothy Ives, Gordon Michael Scallion, Ernest Chick Kallenbach, Jerome Austin Toki, Bill Becker, Don Markle, and Hildur Jackson. I'm especially obliged to the community founders who generously shared their stories. Velma Kahn, Tony Cerna, Arjuna Da Silva, Valerie Naiman, Chuck Marsh, Peter Bain, Diane Braz, Kenneth Mahaffey, Hank Obermeyer, Luke Reed, Dave Henson, and Adam Walpert. Heroes all. Enormous thanks to the people who offer expert advice. Francis Forster, James Hamilton, Bob Watts, Zev Payas, Chris Scott Hansen, Jim Leach, Dave Henson, Gregory Clark, Cindy Maddox, Carolyn Goldschmidt, Steve Goldstein, and Bill Goodman. And those who critique chapters. Tree Bresson, Geoff Cosney, Velma Kahn, Patricia Allison, Harvey Baker, and Paul DeLapa. Very special thanks to Rick Tobin, Brechar Hemiplard, and Don Rose. Acknowledgements. I'm a community founder. I knew when entered medical school in 1967 that I would create an intentional community to offer low-cost medical care. I knew healthcare delivery was in big trouble, and as a nerd activist interested in cybernetics, I wanted to create a model that addressed all the problems of care delivery. In order for healthcare delivery to be inexpensive, I thought the staff should live in the community and it would include farming and host of support facilities. I know the medicine I wanted to practice would include helping stimulate patients, living vital, independent lives, concerned for the health of communities and society as much as of individuals and their families. I had read copious utopian and dystopian literature. I was sure I wanted to do this in an intentional community. I visited Twin Oaks in 1969 and other communities as well, all of which all fed my hunger to live this lifestyle, which I knew would be good for both staff and patient. I knew I would start a community when I graduated in 1971 and wrote up an 8-page paper with our first mission statement. The innocence of that document makes Mesmal today. Like any good nerd, I tried to find any literature to help guide me on how to make me community vision happen. Nothing. So I spoke with fellow communards and Dove Wrighton. I wonder what we would have done differently if we had run into this thorough, intelligent book back then. Maybe looking at all we had to do would have scared us away. We probably had fewer meetings than any founded community in history. We also made every known mistake. Yet for me, community living was a magical 9 years. At a certain point in our process, we realized that in order to continue with our hospital dream, we would have to take most of the steps thy's book lays out so well. Only a few community members wanted to continue in our medical service mission. The rest they've all stayed together these 33 years as family, though no longer as an intentional community. In 1993, the incredible people who Chasido continue to create our medical community realized we needed to do things differently, and made a commitment to the kinds of organizational structures this book suggests. Very few communities would survive long without the depth of structure you'll find here. Whether you use this wisdom or not, it still is worth all the efforts to create and live in community. I've had no burnout or regrets. Community has made everything in my life easier and hazellowed me to have huge dreams, inconceivable without community. The skills I've learned, practical and human, seem infinite. My love for humanity has thrived and expanded. Nothing about community has been easy, but it all hasks the eye forward by patch ADAMS. Been fun. This is the work for political activists who want to live their solutions. If we are to survive as a species, we will do so learning the ecstasy of community. We do have to get together. Creating a life together shows what to pay attention to in forming new communities and ecovillages, and offers exercises to develop community intelligence. Do these exercises, even if you don't agree with them, consider them training wheels. Of course, no book can be complete. Yao still might make a million mistakes. I suggest reading this book and then visiting 10 communities to see how they did it. I thought it would take 4 years to build our free 40-bed hospital in community. Now, in our 33 year, we may finally break ground this year. We're ready. We've learned that the journey to community is nurturing, and so will you. Good luck, forward Roman 13. There is hardly anything more appealing, yet apparently more elusive, for humankind at the end of the 20th century than the prospect of living in harmony with nature and with each other. Robert and Diane Gilman, Ecovillages and sustainable communities do not be afraid to build castles in the sky. That is where they belong. But once the dreams are in place, your job is to build the foundation under them. Henry David Thoreau. IFOUND the land, Jack exclaimed over the phone. As the originator of Earth Dance Farm, a small forming community in northern Colorado, he had been searching for just the right community land for years, since long before and a circle of acquaintances had begun meeting weekly to create community. He was so sure it was the right land, he said, that he'd plunk down $10,000 of his own savings as an option fee to take it off the market for 2 months so that we could decide. I had joined the group several weeks earlier, and I knew nothing about intentional community ties then. However, it had seemed in their meetings that something was missing. What's the purpose of your community? I had finally asked. What's your vision for it? No one could really answer. That Saturday, we all drove out to the land to check it out, and promptly fell apart. Confronted by the reality of buying land, no one wanted to talk of it. Frankly, there was nothing to commit of. No common purpose or vision, no organizational structure, no budget, no agreements. In fact, we hadn't made decisions in the group at all, but had simply talked about how wonderful life in community would be. Although Jack tried mightily to persuade us to go in with him on the land, there were no takers, and Heberly got his money out before the option deadline. The successful 10% I've since learned that Earth Dance Farm's experience is fairly common. Most aspiring Ecovillages and community groups, probably 90%, never get off the ground. Their envisioned communities never get built. They can't find the right land, don't have enough money, or get mired in conflict. Often they simply don't understand how much time, money, and organizational skill they'll need to pull off a project off thy scope. I wanted to know about the successful 10%, those groups that actually created their communities. What did they do right? I've sought the answer to this question ever since, in my years as editor of Communities magazine, and by visiting dozens of communities and interviewing scores of community founders. And I've seen a definite pattern. Generally, founders use the same kinds of skills, knowledge, and step-by-step processes to create widely different kinds of communities, from urban group households or rural ecovillages. Roman 15 introduction, creating a life together. Creating a life together is an overview of that process, gleaned from some of the most innovative and successful community founders in North America. This is what they did, and what you can do to create your community dream. What are intentional communities and ecovillages? A residential or land-based intentional community is a group of people who have chosen to live with or near enough to each other to carry out their shared lifestyle or common purpose together. Families living in a co-housing communities in city. Students living in student housing cooperatives near universities. And sustainability advocates living in rural back-to-the-land homesteads are all members of intentional communities. Community is not just about living together, but about the reasons for doing so. A group of people who have chosen to live together with a common purpose, working cooperatively to create a lifestyle that reflects their shared core values, is one way the nonprofit Fellowship for Intentional Community describes it. What most communities have in common is idealism. They're founded on a vision of living a better way, whether community members literally live together in shared group houses or live near each other as neighbors. A community's ideals usually arise from something its members see as lacking or missing in the wider culture. Ecovillages are intentional communities that aspire to create a more humane and sustainable way of life. One widely quoted definition, by Robert and Tan Gilman, defines ecovillages as human-scale, full-featured settlements in which human activities are harmlessly integrated into the natural world in a way that is supportive of healthy human development, and which can be successfully continued into the indefinite future. An intentional community aspiring to become an ecovillage attempts to have a population small enough that everyone knows each other and can influence the outcome of community decisions. It hopes to provide housing, work opportunities, and social and spiritual opportunities on site, creating as self-sufficient a community as possible. Typically, an ecovillage builds ecologically sustainable housing, grows much off its own organic food, recycles its waste product harmlessly, and as much as possible, generates its own off-grid power. Sirius Ecovillage near Amherst, Massachusetts, grows a large percentage of its organic food, generates a portion of its own off-grid power, and offers tour and classes on sustainable living. Ecovillage at Ithaca has built the first 2 of its 3 planned ecologically oriented co-housing communities on 176 acres near Ithaca, New York, and operates its own organic community-supported agriculture farm for members and neighbors. We'll explore aspiring ecovillages in the following chapters: Dancing Rabbit Ecovillage in Missouri, and Earthaven Ecovillage in North Carolina. Use the term communities in this to mean ecovillages as well as other forms of intentional community. More and more people are yearning for more community in their lives. You may be one of them. These are people who feel increasingly isolated and alienated and want something more satisfying. This can mean seeking to create a community where they are, or it can mean seeking residential, land-based intentional community. It includes co-housing, shared group households, ecovillages, housing co-ops, environmental activist communities, Christian fellowship communities, rural homesteading communities, and so on. Romans 16 CRATING, a life together. Many peruse the hefty communities directory, which lists over 600 communities and where they are and how to join them. Others browse the web for individual community websites, beginning with such starting places as the Fellowship for Intentional Community, www.ike.org, the Co-housing Network, www.cohousing.org, Ecovillage Network of the Americas, www.ecovillage.org, or the Northwest Intentional Communities Association, www.ike.org/NICA. Co-housing communities. Co-housing is another increasingly popular form of contemporary intentional community. Co-housing communities are small neighborhoods of usually 10 to 40 households, which are managed by the residents themselves, and which have usually been developed and designed by them as well, although increasingly co-housers partner with outside developers. Co-housers own their own relatively small housing units and share ownership of the whole property and their large community building, with kitchen, dining room/meeting space, and usually a children's play area, laundry facilities, and guest rooms. Co-housing residents conduct their community business through consensus-based meetings and enjoy optional shared meals together 3 or 4 nights a week. Co-housers believe that it's more readily possible to live lighter on the planet if they cooper, ate with their neighbors, and their lives are easier, more economical, more interesting, and more fun, observes Chuck Durrett, one of 2 architects who introduced co-housing to North America from Denmark in 1986. By 2002, 68 completed co-housing communities were up and running in North America, and approximately 200 more were in various stages of development. The growing interest in intentional communities, whether eco-villages, co-housing, or other kinds of communities, isn't just wishful thinking. By 2002, the yearning for community and individual communities has been favorably and sometimes repeatedly covered by the New York Times, USA Today, the Boston Globe, NBC's Dateline, ABC's Good Morning America, CNN, and National Public Radio. Why now, I believe we're experiencing a culture-wide yet deeply personal phenomenon, as if some kind of switch has simultaneously flipped in the psyches of thousands of people. Aware that we're living in an increasingly fragmented, shallow, venal, costly, and downright dangerous society, and reeling from the presence of guns in the schoolyard and rogues in high office, we're longing for a way of life that's warmer, kinder, more wholesome, more affordable, more cooperative, and more connected. This is partly because we're so unnaturally disconnected. Post-World War II trends toward nuclear families, single-family dwellings, urban and suburban sprawl, and job-related mobility have disconnected us from the web of human connections that nourished people in our grandparents' day, as well as numbing us with simulations of human interaction on TV sitcoms rather than living in a culture small-scale and stable enough that we'd have such interactions ourselves. The people interested in intentional communities aren't extremists. They're the people next door. Many are in their 40s and 50s, they've raised families, built careers, and picked up and moved more times than they can count. They're tired of Madison Avenue's idea of the American dream. They want to settle down, sink roots, introduction Romans 17, and live in the good company of friends. Others are young people, fresh out of college, hyper-aware of our precarious environmental situation, and disgusted with the consumerist mall ethic. They say, no thanks. We're also recognizing that living in community is literally good for us. Scientific research shows that our health improves when we live in a web of connection with others. Of all the many influences on our health, interpersonal relationships are not only a factor, but increasingly are being recognized as the most crucial factor. Physician Blair Voivodich writes in Communities magazine, being connected to other people probably makes you physically healthier than if you lived alone. This appears to be especially true for older people, who tend to stay healthier longer, recover from illness more quickly, and live longer than the elderly not living in community. It's also healthier for the planet. At a time when, every day, we're losing 200,000 acres of rainforest lungs, we're spewing 1 million tons of toxic waste into the atmosphere, and 45,000 people die of starvation every day. Living simply, cooperating, and sharing resources with others may be the only way of life that makes any sense. Small, independent, self-sufficient communities have the greatest ability to survive the normal cycles of boom and bust, which our economy and culture go through, and an even better chance of surviving the major catastrophes which may loom ahead as our oil supply dwindles, writes Tom Hartman in his book The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. What better place than intentional communities to downsize possessions, share ownership of land and tools, grow healthy food, share meals, make decisions collaboratively, and to create the kind of culture that nourishes our children as they grow up, and ourselves as we grow older. And what better place than intentional communities to show the rest of the world that even hypermobile North Americans can choose to live this way? What you'll learn here, it's becoming increasingly obvious to many of us that intentional community living is one key to surviving, even thriving, in these disintegrating times. But, like members of the Earth Dance Farm, few of us know where to start. Creating a life together is an attempt to help your eco-village or intentional community get off to a good start. It attempts to distill the hard experience of the founders of dozens of successful communities formed since the early 90s into solid advice on getting started as a group, creating vision documents, decision-making and governance, agreements and policies, buying and financing land, communication and process, and selecting people to join you. It's the information I was looking for when I began this journey. It's simply what works, what doesn't work, and how not to reinvent the wheel. And this information is not only for people forming new communities, whether or not you already own your land. It can also be valuable for those of you thinking about joining community one day, since you, too, will need to know what works. And it's also for those of you already living in community, since you can online benefit from knowing what others have done in similar circumstances. Because forming a rural community involves more variables than other kinds of communities. For example, how members might make a living. I focus more on rural communities. However, most of the steps and skills described in these chapters apply to urban and suburban creating a life together. Communities as well. This book also focuses on communities in which decisions are made by all community members and doesn't examine issues specific to ashrams, meditation centers, or other spiritual or therapeutic communities in which decisions are made by one leader or a small group. Why you need a legal entity, Chapter 8, and what you should consider before choosing a legal entity in Chapter 15. Apply to forming communities and Ecovillages anywhere. However, information on specific legal entities in Chapters 15 and 16 apply only to the United States. Is this information really necessary? Many communities that formed in the 1970s and 1980s, including large, well-established ones, weren't familiar with most of this information when they started, and apparently didn't need it. Nonetheless, I urge you to learn these steps and skills. Why? First, because establishing an Ecovillage or new community is not easy, then or now. Getting a group of people to agree on a common vision, make decisions collaboratively and fairly, and combine their money with others to own property together can bring up deep-seated emotional issues, often survival-level issues. That can knock a community off its foundations. They want you to have all the help you can get. Second, since the mid-1980s, the cost of land and housing has skyrocketed relative to most people's assets and earning power. Zoning regulations and building codes are considerably more restrictive than they were in earlier decades. And because of media coverage that highlights any violent or extreme practices in agri, the cult stereotype has become part of public consciousness and may affect how potential neighbors feel about your group moving in next door. Newly forming communities can flounder and sink for other reasons. 2. Not being able to agree on location. Not having enough time to vote to research or group process. Not having enough access to capital. Not finding the right land. Based on the hard lessons of the successful 10% and the unsuccessful 90%, today's community founders must be considerably more organized, purposeful, and better capitalized than their counterparts of earlier years. Is this advice corporate? As you skim these pages, you'll see many figures and percentages, business and finance information, and you'll find advice on the spiritual principles involved in forming a community. Is this book just some representation of the system you may be trying to leave behind? Why is there no mention of the spiritual aspects? I'm presuming that your own spiritual impulses and visions about community are already well developed, that you know very well where you want to live in an eco-village or intentional community, or create your own. As for all business and finance advice, consider it a set of tools designed to get you from your unique personal impulses of spirit to the manifestation of that vision in physical form. And while I'm not part of the system, I study the system in order to learn how to use some of its more useful tools to create alternatives to it. As an old adage from India says, it takes a thorn to remove a thorn. Present time, anyway, it takes budgets and business plans and a rudimentary understanding of real estate and financing. to create a society in which these tools are necessary. Consider the skills and steps in this book to beth shovels and soil amendments you'll need to grow your own community, from the seeds off your vision into a flourishing organism. Introduction, Roman 19. How to use this book. Most of the skills to learn and steps to take in forming an eco-village or intentional community are not linear, but simultaneous. So although Thane formation is presented in a step-by-step way, some tasks must be undertaken together. For example, although you'll need to create a legal entity for owning land before you buy property there, what kind of land you want as well how you intend to organize ownership and decision-making makes all the difference in which legal structure you choose in the first place. I suggest first reading this book quickly to get an overview, and then a second time, slowly and thoroughly, then collect and read other resources for more detailed information. I also suggest that in your group read this book, not just those who are getting started and assuming leadership roles. The more of you who are informed and hopefully disabused of common misconceptions about starting new ecovillages and communities, the more empowered and effective I will be as a group. So let's get started. Roman 20 CRETNG, a life together. Part 1, planting the seeds of healthy community. One gray Northern California night in November 1988, 6 would-be community founders piled into a small pickup truck and headed for Oregon. Their vision at the time was to create a community land trust with house in the Bay Area and rural land within commuting distance. They just learned of an 87-acre property with a stream and 25 buildings in rural Oregon that had fallen to the IRS in the 1970s for $1.7 million in unpaid taxes. The former site of a Christian intentional community, the property had a large dining lodge and kitchen, 12 small rustic cabins, 2 dorms that could sleep 125, laundry and garden outbuildings, a large wood shop, an office classroom complex, and a partially finished residential fourplex. Back taxes notwithstanding, it was what many community founders dream of, a rural property with many buildings, so off they went. 10 hours later, they clambered out of the ramp truck into the cold rain and surveyed the scene. It was extraordinarily depressing, recalls Diane Bras. What had once been groomed beautiful lawn was now shoulder-high grass. The once beautiful vegetable garden grew thistles 8 feet high. 45 acres of formerly magnificent forest was an open field off stumps and brambles, clear-cut 7 years early, by the Christian group to raise money to pay their tax lawyers. Pushing through the wet Walsoff grass, the visitors examined the first few buildings. Most, empty and neglected for almost 7 years, had broken windows, rotting roofs, and sagging steps. The group creaked open doors, toughened cold, dirty, foul-smelling rooms full of debris and mold. When the former owners realized the IRS would foreclose on their property, they stripped the buildings of everything movable: furniture, carpets, sinks, stoves, vent fans, and fixtures. They had ripped the sprinklers out off the lawns and removed every light bulb. Now, as the group picked their way through litter, broken glass, and dead birds, they found no running water. The pipes had frozen and broken the previous year. Not only this, they said, but the property would probably now cost at least $500,000. Its zoning had reverted from multiple occupancy to the county-wide regulation of no more than 5 unrelated adults. And the place was probably still saddled with Moo's IRS debt. Cold, soaked, and miserable, that group left. Obviously, the place was a bust. 2 Chapter 1 the successful 10%, and why 90% fail. But not for 2 members on that fateful day. Deanne Bras, a former conference center teacher, saw beautiful land with gentle meadows and some great trees left standing, excellent gardening potential, and all the right buildings, an ideal community and retreat conference center. Kenneth Mahaffey, a businessman who bought, renovated, and rented out old houses, saw an excellent piece of real estate, an exciting land purchase challenge, and the ideal site for a community tie. Diane had experience and interest in community and good people skills. Kenneth had expertise in real estate and finance. Both were movers and shakers who made things happen. Within 6 months, they had closed on the property. Today, it is Lost Valley Educational Center, a thriving community of 22 adults and 7 children, with clean, renovated buildings, restored vegetable gardens, a reforestation project with sapling Douglas firs and hardwoods, and a vibrant conference center business. Lost Valley, how one group did it. Kenneth and Diane's first challenge was finding out who controlled the property and to whom they should submit a bid. Was the IRS still in charge? Since it had been 7 years since the IRS takeover, was the huge tax lien about Tokesbury? After much confusion and delay, they were finally able to send a bid via a local legal firm representing the unknown owners. Thought he were told they must not, under any circumstances, contact the IRS. The property had been appraised at $557,000 a few years earlier, and before that, when it was still forested, at $750,000. The back property tax bill turned out to be $50,000, but they believed it could be reduced. Many other parties had been interested in the property. Andone had bid $250,000 a few months earlier, but were no longer sure they could pay it. By guessing at their chances of success, the possible back taxes outcome, the probable challenge to rezoning, and the property's state of ruin, Kenneth took a leap of faith and bid $80,000 over dollars. The next 3 months they heard nothing. Their inquiries led nowhere, and they get conflicting stories about who really controlled the property. Finally, Kenneth and Diane contacted the IRS directly, and eventually learned that the legal owners were now the Seattle law firm that had fought the IRS on behalf of the previous owners. They called the Seattle lawyers, who said they knew nothing off the bid. The next day, however, they called back, saying, "If you can raise $90,000, we can close in 3 weeks." With closing costs and lawyers' fees, the property would cost about $100,000. Kenneth raised the money from friends, creating 3-month bridge loans at 8-10% interest. Has stipulated in his sales offer that the IRS rescind their $1.7 million lien on the property. The 7-year period was up, and the IRS had toed-side whether to sue for the money or drop the claim. Fortunately, they chose to drop it. Kenneth and Diane incorporated Lost Valley Center, Inc., a 501(c)(3) nonprofit educational organization. The property closed in April 1989 technically. Kenneth held the title, but the new nonprofit considered itself the proudner of 87 acres of grass, thistles, and rundown buildings. Although it still had a $50,000 back dollars property tax burden and uncertain future rezoning, they'd scored a $500,000 property. In a few months, Kenneth remortgaged one off his real estate holdings and paid off the bridge loans. Then he loaned the organization another $100,000 to create a fund to repair and renovate the property. The successful 10% and why 90% fail 3. Like many other community founders, they faced a serious zoning challenge. The previous owners had been allowed multiple occupancy, but the county planning department decided that property's grandfather clause was invalid because of the length of time between the previous use and current use of the property. So the property reverted to the county's normal zoning rules, meaning no more than 5 unrelated adults could live on the land, despite the fact it was 87 acres with 25 buildings. While they eventually did manage to get the multiple occupancies zoning grain-stated, buying the property without knowing this was quite a gamble. Usually, to be among 10%, community founders need to resolve zoning issues before buying the land. 2 months later, in June, Diane, Kenneth, and 5 others interested in becoming community pioneers moved to the land and set to work with a will. The first month, they cleared all the buildings off piles of junk, rebuilt the water system, restored the basic landscaping, and planted Ackwater Raker vegetable garden. By August, they'd set up the wood shop and the Lost Valley Center's business offices and repaired the dorm buildings, one of the 4-plex residences, the dining hall, and 5 classrooms. They created a brochure for their conference and retreat center and plastered local stores and bulletin boards with flyers, following advice to be as active and public as possible about their intended conference center activities. They went out of their way to meet their neighbors and join in neighborhood picnics and volleyball games and invite the neighbors to their open houses. In September, joined by a few more pioneering residents, they renovated some of the cabins, set up their commercial kitchen, supplied their dorms with mattresses, blankets, and linens, and bought used furniture for all facilities. In October, they hosted their first conference. Another challenge was to show the county the back property taxes of $50,000 should be reduced. Lost Valley pointed out that according to county law, since they and the previous owners were both 501(c) nonprofits, they shouldn't be penalized for the length of time lapsed between the dissolution of the previous community and their own purchase of the land. The county agreed, and in January 1990, reduced the back taxes to about $10,000. The Dollars County also generously decided that the work of Lost Valley fell within their own tax-exempt guidelines and wouldn't be liable for further property taxes as long as all activities on the property supported Lost Valley's own tax-exempt purposes. Over the first 4 months of 1990, Lost Valley residents and volunteers also planted more gardens and began a reforestation project, starting 1,000 trees in their seed orchard and 800 baby Douglas fir and other trees in the clearcut. They developed a watershed restoration program with federal agencies, designed ancient forest tour programs, and began agricultural research and educational projects. They held their first residential permaculture design course and began a monthly environmental education program. They continued renovating, cleaning, or replacking all their carpets, installing fire safety systems, and renovating another cabin. They remodeled a small building as a staff kitchen, and Youth Hosteland began hosting overnight guests. Lost Valley was on its way. What works, what doesn't work? Since the early 1990s, I've been intensely curious about what it takes for a newly forming community, or Ecovillage, to succeed. So, first as publisher of a newsletter about forming communities for CREATING A Life Together, and then as editor of Communities magazine, interviewed dozens of people involved in the process of forming new communities and Ecovillage projects, as well as founders of established communities. I wanted to know what worked, what didn't work, and how not to reinvent the wheel. I learned that no matter how inspired and visionary the founders, only about 1 out of 10 new communities actually get built. The other 90% seem to go nowhere, occasionally because of lack of money or not finding the right land, but mostly because of conflict. And usual lie, conflict accompanied by heartbreak. And sometimes conflict, heartbreak, and lawsuits. What was going on here? These people started out trying to create a way of life based on ideals of friendship, goodwill, cooperation, and fair decision-making. What had these founders not known? The successful 10% Lost Valley story illustrates the major steps of forming a new community or Ecovillage, establishing a core group with a particular vision and purpose, choosing a legal structure, finding and financing property, and moving in and renovating or developing land. It also involves creating an internal community economy and refinancing any initial loans if necessary. Since ecovillages are a form of intentional community, I'll use the term community to mean ecovillages as well as other forms of community. Each of the communities will look at has undertaken a similar journey and roughly in the same order. Most of the 7 founders of Sewing Circle Occidental Arts and Ecology Center in Northern California were an already established group of friends and housemates who, in 1995, formed a partnership, later replaced by a limited liability company, to purchase a property, and a 501(c) 3 nonprofit to manage their planned conference center business. They conducted a thorough property search, finding an 80-acre, $1 million property with existing community buildings and cabins. They bought it for $850,000, paid for by a combination of owner financing and loans from their families, and second and third mortgages from friends and colleagues. They moved in and renovated for 8 months, started up their conference center Business, and refinanced with a single private loan 5 years later. In 1998, dozens of web surfers from around the country coalesced around an internet call for people to co-found an income-sharing community in rural New England. After planning the Meadowdance community via email and in person for a year, the forming community group located 165 acres of nearly ideal land in rural Vermont for $250,000. $6 group members willing to move ahead formed a limited liability partnership, and through members' loans raised most of the funds to buy and develop the property. They spent a year seeking a conditional use permit from the county for their large multi-purpose community building. But after spending $20,000 on tests, permits, and fees, they didn't get heat. So they bought a house in town and started up their software testing and typing/editing businesses there. In 2002, after the business had started to take off, they began looking for rural land again. Each of these communities are among 10%. The forming communities that actually get up and running. We'll learn more about each of them in later chapters. But what about the other 90% of forming communities? The ones that fail. The successful 10%, and why 90% fail 5*, the figure is somewhat higher for forming co-housing communities. Approximately 25% seem to actually get built, according to co-housing magazine editor Stella Tarnay. Why 90% fail in the early 1990s? A founder I'll call Sharon bought land for a spiritual community I'll call Gracelight. At first it looked promising. Sharon had received unprecedented and unusually rapid-zoning approval for a clustered housing site. She met regularly with a group of friends and supporters who wanted to be part of the community. But over the next 18 months, first the original group, and then a second group fell apart, disappointed and bitter. Sharon struggled with money issues, land development issues, interpersonal issues. After 2 years, she said she was no longer attempting community, and in fact loathed the idea of community and didn't even want to hear the C word. What had this founder not known? How much money it would take to complete the land development process before she could legally transfer title to each incoming community member. Sharon had no budget in advance, and no idea what heat would cost to complete county requirements for a site plan and roads, utilities, etc. How much each lot would eventually cost, and that she shouldn't have fostered hope in those who could never afford to buy in. Sharon knew that some people in the group wouldn't be able to buy in, but counted on her sense that it will all work out somehow. That she'd need adequate legal documents and financial data to secure private financing. Sharon believed battling potential financial contributors' spiritual vision for Gracelight was sufficient. It didn't occur to her to provide a business plan, budget, or financial disclosure sheet, or to demonstrate to potential investors how and when they might get their money back. That she should make it clear to everyone at the outset that as well as having a vision, she was also serving as land developer. Sharon didn't think of herself as a developer, and never used the term, in spite of the fact that she financed and was responsible for the purchase and development of the land. That she needed to tell people that she fully intended to be reimbursed for her land purchase and development costs and make a profit to compensate her time and entrepreneurial risk. Sharon didn't think in terms like entrepreneurial risk, even though she was taking one. When group members in the first and second forming community group's final lie brought up financial issues and asked pointed questions, she was offended, and group members were offended too, when they learned Sharon was going to make a profit. One can argue for or against making a profit on community land. The point is, Sharon didn't make her intentions clear at the outset. That she needed to tell people from the beginning that, as the developer, she would make all land development decisions. Again, one can argue either way about one person making decisions about this or her own financial risks in forming a community. But Sharon should have made these clear. That a process was needed for who was in the group and who wasn't, and for what kinds of decisions the group would make 6 CREATNG a life together, and which Sharon alone would make. That consensus was the wrong decision-making option for a group with no common vision or purpose, with one landowner and others with no financial risk, and with no clear distinction between those who were decision-making members of the group and those who were not. In fact, the group wasn't practicing consensus at all, but rather some vaguely conceived idea of it. Structural conflict, and 6 ways to reduce it after years of interviewing founders like Sharon and hearing their stories of community breakup, heartbreak, and even lawsuits. I began to see a pattern. Most new community failures seem to result from what I call structural conflict, problems that arise when founders don't explicitly put certain processes in place, or make certain important decisions at the outset, creating one or more omissions in their organizational structure. These built-in structural problems seem to function like time bombs. Several weeks, months, or even years into the community forming process, group erupts in major conflict that could have been largely prevented if they had handled these issues early on. Naturally, this triggers a great deal of interpersonal conflict at the same time, making the initial structural conflict much worse. While interpersonal conflict is normal and expected, I believe that much of the structural conflict in failed communities could have been prevented, or at least greatly reduced, if the founders had paid attention to at least 6 crucial elements in the beginning. Each of these issues, if not addressed in the early stages of a forming community, can generate structural conflict time bombs later on one. Identify your community vision and creative vision documents. There's probably no more devastating source of structural conflict in community than various members having different visions for why you're there in the first place. This will erupt into all kinds of arguments about what seem like ordinary topics. How much money you spend on a particular project, or how much or how often you work on a task. It's really a matter of underlying differences, perhaps not always conscious, about what the community is for. All your community members need to be on the same page from the beginning, and must know what your shared community vision is and know you all support it. Your shared vision should be thoroughly discussed, agreed upon, and written down at the get-go. See Chapter 4. 2. Choose a fair, participatory decision-making process appropriate for your group. And if you choose consensus, get trained in it. Unless you're forming a spiritual, religious, or therapeutic community with a spiritual leader who will make all decisions, and you all agree to this in advance, your members will resent any power imbalances. Resentment over power issues can become an enormous source of conflict in community. Decision-making is the most obvious point of power, and the more it is shared and participatory, the less this particular kind of conflict will come up. This means everyone in the group has a voice in decisions that will affect their lives in community, with a decision-making method that is fair and even-handed. How it works, the procedure for your decision-making method, has to be well understood by everyone in the group. The successful 10% and why 90% fail 7. A more specific source of community conflict is using the consensus decision-making process without thoroughly understanding it. What often passes for consensus in many groups is merely pseudo-consensus, which exhausts people, drains their energy and goodwill, generates a great deal of resentment all by itself, and causes people to despise the process they call consensus. So if your group plans to use consensus, you'll prevent a great deal of structural conflict by getting trained in it first. See Chapter 6. 3. Make clear agreements in writing. This includes choosing an appropriate legal entity for owning land together. People remember things differently. Your agreements, from the most mundane to the most legally and financially significant, should absolutely be written down. Then if later you all remember things differently, you can always look it up. The alternative, we're right but you folks are wrong and maybe you're even trying to cheat us, can break up a community faster than you can say. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. See Chapter 7. 4. Learn good communication and group process skills. Make clear communication and resolving conflicts a priority. Being able to talk with one another about sensitive subjects and still feel connected is my definition of good communication skills. This includes methods for holding each other accountable for agreements. I consider it a setup for structural conflict down the road if you don't address communication and group process skills and conflict resolution methods early in. Addressing these issues at the start will allow you to have procedures in place later on when things get tense, like practicing fire drill procedures now, when there's no fire. See Chapter 17 and Chapter 18. 5. In choosing co-founders and new members, select for emotional maturity. An often overwhelming source of conflict is allowing someone to enter your forming community group, or later, to enter your community, who is not aligned to your vision and values. Or someone whose emotional pain, surfacing weeks or months later as disruptive attitudes or behaviors, can end up costing you untold hours of meeting time and draining your group of energy and well-being. A well-designed process for selecting and integrating new people into your group and screening out those who don't resonate with your values, vision, or behavioral norms can save repeated rounds of stress and conflict in few weeks and years ahead. See Chapter 18. 6. Learn the head skills and heart skills you need to know. Forming a new community is like simultaneously trying to start a new business and begin a marriage, and is every bit as serious as doing either. It requires many of the same planning and financial skills as launching a successful business enterprise, and the same capacities for trust, goodwill, and honest, kind interpersonal communication as marrying your sweetheart. Foundersoft's successful new communities seem to know this. Yet those who get mired in severe problems have usually leapt in without a clue. Like Sharon, these well-meaning folks did know what they didn't know. So the sixth major way to reduce structural conflict is to take the time to learn what you'll need to know. Community founders must cultivate both heart skills and head skills. This means learning how to make fair, participatory group decisions. 8CREATING a life together. How to speak from the heart. How to face conflict when it arises and deal with it constructively. And how to make cooperative decisions and craft fair agreements. It means learning how to create budgets, timelines, and strategic plans, and how to evaluate legal entities for land ownership or business or educational activities. It means learning the real estate market in your desired area, local zoning regulations, and if needed, how to secure loans with reasonable terms. It means learning how to structure healthy and affordable internal community finances. It means learning about site planning and land development. It means doing all this with a sense of connection and shared adventure. Plunging into the land search process, or trying to raise money without first understanding these interrelated areas, is a sure invitation to trouble. Community founders tend to be specialists, but in fact, they must be generalists. I've seen founders with spiritual ideals and compelling visions flounder and sink because they have no idea how to conduct a land search or negotiate a bank loan. I've seen founders with plenty of technical or business savvy folks able to build an NFT composting toilet or craft a solid strategic plan, who didn't know the first thing about how to speak honestly and from the heart to another human being. And I've seen sensitive spiritual folks as well as type A get the job done. Folks crash and burn the first time they encountered any real conflict. Not everyone in your forming group needs to have all these skills or all this information. That's one reason you're a group. Nor must your group possess all these skills and areas of expertise among yourselves when you begin. You can always hire training for your group or expertise in whatever you need, whether it be a consensus trainer, communication skills trainer, meeting facilitator, lawyer, accountant, project manager developer, land use planner, permaculture redesigner, and so on. Many well-established North American communities never included most or all of the Sussex structural ingredients at their origin, and don't see why they should have. We're here now, aren't we? In the 1960s, 70s, or early 80s, people usually just bought land and got started. Some of these communities are still with us today, and proud of it. Nonetheless, for communities forming today, I recommend addressing all 6 of these issues early on, for all the reasons already noted. What will it cost? How much it will cost in total, and how much it will cost each founder is a question that can only be estimated by creating a financial model and plugging in the numbers. To do that, you'll need to start with certain assumptions. Will Yaub rural, semi-rural, suburban, or urban? What are land values in your desired area? Will you innovate or develop your property? How many members will you have? Will you have community businesses? How will you structure your internal community finances to meet monthly land payments and other expenses? If your numbers show that your plan is too expensive or otherwise unworkable, revise some of your assumptions and try again. How much it costs communities that have formed since the early 1990s, when it became harder to do than in previous decades, varies widely, depending on all the above factors, but mostly on land values. For example, in 1996, 7 founders of Abundant Dawn community bought a beautiful 90-acre owner-financed parcel on a river with a farmhouse, cabin, and barn in rural southwestern Virginia for $130,000. The dollars successful 10%, and why 90% fail now. They paid $13,000 down, contributing slightly more than $1,800 each. At the other end of the spectrum, in 1994, 7 founders of Sewing Circle Occidental Arts and Ecology Center bought an 80-acre, owner-financed, fully developed turnkey property in Sonoma County, California with rolling hills, panoramic views, stands of oak and redwood, 2 20-year-old organic gardens, and 16 community buildings and cabins. They paid $850,000, with each member contributing about $20,000 to the $150,000 down payment. Figure on several $100,000 or more to buy and develop your land, depending on your desired area and the magnitude of your plans. The cost per person will depend on how many founders and/or members split that costs. If you use owner financing, private financing, or bank financing, multiply that amount several times over for the true land purchase cost, including all the principal and interest payments you'll be making over the years. See chapters 910, 11, 12, and 14. How long does it take? It also takes enormous amounts of time to pull off a project of this magnitude. Even if you meet weekly, you'll still need people to work on various committees that work and/or meet between scheduled meetings, gathering information, calling officials, crunching the numbers, drafting proposals, and so on, for at least a year or eventual years or longer. The founders of Dancing Rabbit Ecovillage in Missouri first explored their ideas and organized their initial group in 1993, began their land search in 1995, and bought land in 1996. They worked steadily to develop it and raise their population for the next 6 years, and they continue to do so. The founders of Earthaven Ecovillage in North Carolina began with an original group in 1990, searched for land for 4 years, reorganized their group, and bought land in 1994, and refinanced and began developing in 1995. They have spent the past 7 years developing it and increasing their membership, and they also continue to do so. Generally, the larger your group and/or the smaller your assets, the longer it'll take. And the fewer your numbers and the greater your assets, the faster it will happen. For example, the founder of Mariposa Grove, an urban community in Oakland, California, began looking for property in 1998, bought it in cash in 1999, and spent the next 3 years renovating it and attracting members. The 2 founders of Lost Valley Educational Center found their property in 1988, bought it, also paying cash, in 1989, and renovated it, and got it ready to host workshop participants by 1990. They've spent the past 12 years continuing to develop the physical infrastructure and build the community. So this is really a trick question. While it can take from a year to several years to find and buy property, develop it, and establish your membership and financial base, there's really no endpoint. Like a marriage or a business, growing a community is never really done. How many people do you need? Forming community groups usually start out with 1 or 2 or a few people with an idea, grow larger, fluctuating in size as people attend a few meetings for a while and get more involved or lose interest and leave, and shrink to a much smaller number when it's time to commit monito by a particular piece of property. See Figure 1 on page 11. For some examples of how many people are involved in the communities, we'll examine in this book 10, CRATING, A Life Together. The successful 10%. And why 90% fail 11, Lost Valley 20 plus 7, 12,223 rural OR. 87 acres founded 1988-89, Earthaven 15,015, 2012. 2157 rural NC. 320 acres founded 1990-94, Sewing Circle 105, 12,711, Occidental Arts and Ecology Center Semi-Rural. Ka 80 acres founded. 1991-94, Dancing Rabbit 500, 100,020, 30,616, rural, Mo. 280 acres founded 1993-96, Abundant, Dawn 40, 600, 1,279, rural. Vaughn 90 acres founded 1994-96, Mariposa, Grove 12, 13,019, urban. Ka founded 1998-99, Meadowdens 50. 75, 30, 40 online, 69, rural VT. 20, in-person founded 1998-00, community total envisioned hash of members at early meetings members at property purchase members in 2002, table 1. How many people do you need? It doesn't just take information and skills, money, time, and people to form a community, but also a sense of connection, sometimes called community glue, born of group experiences like preparing and eating meals together, work parties, weekend trips, and long, intimate conversations. Gathering and weaving the thread off skills, information, money, time, people, and experiences is complex and often overwhelming. What co-housing activist Zev Payas calls the longest, most expensive personal growth workshop you'll ever take. Next, we'll take a look at the kind of person who pulls it off, that unsung hero, the community founder 12, CRATING, a life together newly forming spiritual communities, seem to experience a more structural conflict than most groups. Probably because spiritual community founders sometimes tend towards a soft focus, whole picture orientation, what's popularly called right-brained thinking. This often frustrates and even repels other potential co-founders who may use more logical or systematic, left-brained thinking. Like Sharon, founders of spiritual communities are sometimes accused of deceiving authors about money and power issues, when in fact these simply hadn't focused on clear, explicit communication about finances and decision-making, and didn't realize such clarity was necessary. These founders often dismiss the primarily left-brained potential co-founders who could help them, considering them merely bean counters, when the latter simply want to understand the financial, legal, and decision-making arrangements before they leap in wholeheartedly. If you operate more in right-brained mode, I urge you to ally yourself with more left-brained compadres who can help ground your community ideals in workable business and legal strategies. And if you're a hardcore left-brainer, I urge you to hook up with more holistically oriented colleagues who will help you keep your heart open and help you remember why you want to bring forth this wonderful vision in the first place. We set out to change our world. By Roberta Wilson, as fate would have it, Winslow Co-housing on Bainbridge Island near Seattle, formed in 1988, ended up being the first owner-developed co-housing community in the U.S. We certainly didn't have much experience to go on. Only one of us had lived in an intentional community, and only a few had even visited any intentional communities. None of us had seen co-housing in Denmark, and of course there were no models of it close to home. What we had was McCammont and Durrett's co-housing book and an incredible amount of energy. As with all communities, we made some wise chases and some poor ones. We met every weekend for over 2 years, with many of us meeting in spiritual COMMUNITIS, Trouble in Paradise. The successful 10%, and why 90% fail 13 committees during the week. This vigorous schedule allowed us to buy land, get through the construction process, and move into our 30 duplexes and flats by spring 1992. But it cost us potential members who couldn't devote such time to development. Finding loans for what looked to financial institutions, like some kind of middle-income commune, was difficult and may have cost one credit union representative his job. Stress resulting from engaging some of our own members to work for us hurt the group and hurt some of these members as well. Our original group was deeply bonded by the sheer effort of the project. Yet, after move-in, we retreated to our individual homes to recuperate. While our idealism had carried us through the forming stages, we weren't quite prepared for the reality of living cooperatively. So many of us were used to having our own way in the world. We also had the inevitable turnover. We had problems with new residents who either had their own heroic notions, or who soared and then dove as the honeymoon phase ended. We had kids who couldn't get along, a dog that bit, divorces and deaths, births and celebrations. For the most part, our surrounding neighbors were friendly. We figured out a work system, each serving on clusters, administration, process and communication, grounds and common facilities. We figured out a meal system, with dinners 5 nights a week. We figured out how to work with consensus. We learned to keep good track of our finances, and we continued to work towards emotional literacy. We still struggle with issues such as member participation and how to make capital improvements, yet our meetings are now civil, efficient, and more emotionally honest. Folks have found their own level after the first years of feeling overwhelmed. Some of them have been disappointed with the lack of emotional intimacy, while others, especially teens, have felt uncomfortable living in a fishbowl. At times, most of us have probably asked ourselves, what am I doing here? A question, I believe, that arises from a complex calculation off time and energy spent and one's tolerance for conflict. Sometimes I've asked myself, after a difficult confrontation, why I should put so much of my life energy into something that seems, at the time, to give back little. Yet I'm sure that at other times each of us has surely declared, I can't imagine living anywhere else. A response to the very personal exchanges that make living in community so rewarding. I can call me neighbor and ask her to turn off the coffee pot that I forgot. Children come to visit and play with my dog. A neighbor pauses from her chores a moment and tells me about her life. In the forest, we scatter the ashes of a member who died. In our orchard, we bury the family dog. A neighbor's sister comes to stay and offers massages. The children are delivered to school by adults who share the duty. Our community feels safe. The idealism, dreams, and devotion, while still her, have given ground to the practical and the real experience of living in community, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Community is seeping into ourselves, I believe, so that even the challenges become a just part of who we each are. Cooperative culture is gaining ground over our individual upbringing and competition. Slowly, we are giving up the need for absolute control. We set out to change our world, and no community is changing us. Excerpted with permission from Communities magazine, Spring 2000. Valerienaiman was a woman with a mission. In 1991, as she and a group of people interested in forming community in the mountains off western North Carolina began their land search, she sold her local business so she could devote full time to the project. To better understand the local real estate market and real estate financing, she studied for and got real estate sales and brokers' licenses, and took a job with a local realty company, which allowed the group to learn about any new properties as soon as they came on the market. She also contacted communitarians nationwide, asking which legal entities they'd chosen for group land ownership, and why, and she learned as much as she could about the various legal entities communities could use to own property. She studied community land trusts, making calls to the School of Living in Pennsylvania, and by visiting the Institute for Community Economics in Ohio, organizations that help groups set up community land trusts. She eventually didn't recommend this specific form of land ownership to the group, and they later created a homeowners association to own property and a 501(c)(3) nonprofit to carry out its educational mission. In 1993, the group found 320 acres of owner-financed land that fit most of their criteria. After the group spent over a year in confusion and conflict about the community's ultimate vision and whether or not to buy this particular property, Valerie drew up and submitted a contract on Theland herself, with a loophole in case she needed to get out of it. She hosted a founders meeting of tea and fundraising, inviting group members who shared the same community vision and an interest in this particular property, as well as other local people interested in forming an intentional community. By the end of the afternoon, they had raised the $100,000 down payment. Over the next few months, the group continued adding members and raising funds to begin developing the property, and bought it in December 1990 for the following year. Valerie visited the E.F. Schumacher Society in Massachusetts to learn how the group could create a small, private shoebox bank to raise funds. The group adopted this idea, created the Earthshares Fund, and over the next few years raised enough money to pay off owner financiers. Other founders of successful 10% communities have traveled a similar path. Recent college graduates Tony Cerna and Cecil Shabe 14 Chapter 2 your role as founder. Were environmental activists with degrees in computer science and civil engineering, respectively, before founding Dancing Rabbit in Missouri. They educated themselves well in real estate, zoning regulations, financing possibilities, and nonprofit legal structures to buy their land and create the financial and legal structures that support their Ecovillage dream. In order to establish the Sewing Circle community and its nonprofit educational organization, Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, co-founder Dave Henson left his environmental activist job and spent 8 months as the group's full-time point person. He researched possible property sites and sources of financing and donations, negotiated with the owner of their chosen site, and drafted and instituted various financial and legal plans through which to carry out their purpose. And Luke Reed, a software engineer and co-founder of Meadowdance Community in Vermont, was an almost full-time online and offline student of every aspect of community development he could find, learning as much Ash could about what had and had not worked well in other recently formed communities. Contrast these folks with Sharon and Gracelight Community. Well-meaning and motivated, Sharon nevertheless hadn't a clue that she needed to educate herself in new fields and develop new skills to pull off a task of this magnitude. Community founders must anticipate challenges not faced by community founders of farlier times. These include the fact that property isn't ideal if zoning regulations and building codes prevent you from developing it the way you want to. If your group wants ruraland, a lack of decent paying local jobs will affect your community's attractiveness to future members. Difficulty attracting members will affect your ability to pay back any land purchase and development loans. So your group must consider your site relative to available jobs before buying land. And the initial impression your group makes on potential neighbors will affect whether they will support your getting any needed conditional use permits or zoning variances. What kind of person founds a community? Certain recognizable characteristics stand out in successful community founders, or at least among burning souls, a co-housing term for vision-driven founders who work zealously to manifest their dreams. Deanne Bras and Kenneth Mahaffey of Lost Valley are clearly burning souls. So are Valerie Naiman of Earthaven, Tony Cerna and Cecil Shave of Dancing Rabbit, Dave Hensonoff Sewing Circle OAEC, Luke Reed of Meadowdance, and other founders you'll meet in these pages. Founders need to be visionaries, people who can imagine, visualize, or feel something that doesn't exist yet. Most of the group seeing Lost Valley property for the first time saw a dreary wreck. Kenneth and Diane saw a thriving community and well-appointed, successful conference center. Founders must be leaders, people who can inspire others to believe a particular vision is possible, and who motivate them to take action and make that vision come true. The people Hodgen, Diane, and Kenneth at Lost Valley wouldn't have jumped into that uncertain venture, or worked so fiercely over the first year, without Diane's and Kenneth's burning belief that Lost Valley would soon host successful workshops and conferences. Your role as Founder 15. Founders of the 10% are often successful entrepreneurs, or have at least one experienced entrepreneur in their group. Technically, an entrepreneur is someone with the ability to organize and manage a business, assuming thirst for the sake of the profit. But I'm referring mainly to the aspect of instinctive business savvy, someone with an inner radar about what will work financially. Entrepreneurs take risks based as much on intuition as on experience. They take the initiative. They're focused, task-oriented, on point. They know how to create budgets and strategic plans. Kenneth Mahaffey was a successful real estate investor before co-founding Lost Valley. He took an enormous risk buying property that might require paying $50,000 of back taxes and might not have the necessary use permit restored. Valerie Naiman had been a successful movie costume designer and owner of a retail costume shop. She took a huge risk by selling her business and investing time and money to pursue legal structures and real estate for an untested, non-mainstream project, then investing substantial sums in Earthaven's down payment and Earth Shares Fund. Not all people with this ability use it to make money. Dave Henson, who has entrepreneurial savvy in spades, was a fairly well-known and effective environmental activist before co-founding the Sewing Circle OAEC project. And lastly, founders must be physical builders, people who know how to alter their property to help create their vision, from renovating a building to digging ponds, building cabins, or erecting solar panels. Kenneth Mahaffey and Diane Bras and the first members threw themselves into cleaning and renovating the Lost Valley property, as did Dave Henson and his fellow co-founders at Sewing Circle OAEC. As soon as they'd purchased their properties, Valerie Naiman and the co-founders of Earthaven, and Tony Cerna and Cecil Schaub and the co-founders of Dancing Rabbit, immediately began building roads, setting up camping areas, and creating the first rudimentary shelters on their undeveloped parcels of land. Vision, leadership, entrepreneur.